Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Select gathering at the moment. Hopefully more can join us. Just say, my name's Mike Coates. I'm an Assistant Director in the Competition and Markets Authority, where we enforce consumer protection legislation. We deal with many things in the Competition and Markets Authority. On the competition side, we tend to deal with how businesses interact with each other. On the consumer protection side, we deal with how businesses interact directly with consumers, and I work on that side of the organisation. And for the last few years, I have been leading an investigation into fashion retailers in terms of misleading environmental claims. So, what I just want to cover briefly is our overall approach within the CMA, what we are trying to do with regards to sustainability, not just on consumer protection, but across the organisation. I'll then touch briefly on some guidance that we issued last year, which I think is really important when businesses are trying to come together to improve things within their sector. I'll then go through the Green Claims Code, which is the main piece of guidance that we've put out on consumer protection legislation. Talk briefly about our fashion investigation, because now we've concluded that there are some important findings coming out of that and some important sort of bits of guidance and advice that you need to be aware of, because I think it will help you understand what you need to do to ensure that when you're making a claim about sustainability or environmental credentials, that you're making them clearly and accurately and you're not falling foul of the law. I'll then also briefly touch on our international work and how we're working with other enforcers in the UK. So anyone none of you will have read our annual plan, but if you'd read it over the last few years, you'll have seen that this is an area that we are getting more and more keen to engage in, to ensure that there's growth in any market that helps improve sustainability. So that's the statement that we've made in our annual plan for this year. And this is the piece of guidance I was talking about. It's on the competition side of the organisation, but it's quite unusual for us to put out guidance of this kind. What we've realised is that it's so important that to achieve the benefits in some of these markets, that businesses are really going to have to collaborate and cooperate. If you're going to go upstream to where you source a lot of your products and stuff, often you'll need to collaborate in order to gain the real sort of benefits from a sustainability point of view, whether it's eradicating fossil fuels at some stage of production or trying to source from a particular producer or something like that, where you need to come together to agree as a sector, as an industry, how you're going to behave, then you could fall foul of competition law. So if you're collaborating and you're agreeing to share like pricing and stuff like this, or you're agreeing to not use a particular producer or preferring another, then that could fall foul of competition law. So the guidance is aimed to help businesses understand, one, where agreements are likely to infringe, two, where they're unlikely to infringe, so you don't need to worry about it, but also where they could infringe, but nevertheless the benefits to businesses or to the sector and to the environment outweigh those negative impacts on competition. And for the first time ever, we have encouraged businesses to come to us if they want to enter into some of these agreements and they're not sure how competition law might apply. Then we've actually got an open door policy for advice. We've never done this on any other piece of our work at all, but there is a contact point there if people are thinking about collaborating in the sector and they're a bit worried that they might fall foul of competition law. So that's on the competition side. I'm here mainly to talk about the consumer protection side of the work we've been doing, and the main thing we did was produce our Green Claims Code back in September 2021. Hopefully some of you will have heard of it. It's basically guidance that is aimed at business, and we've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. Some people have responded very positively to it. They say it's quite accessible. But because we're dealing with law that is principles-based, i.e., it applies in a particular context, when certain things happen and a trader behaves in a particular way, it's very much high level. We've tried to illustrate with examples throughout how the code applies, how the law applies. But anyway, it's there and it's meant to be as accessible as possible. It's now been out for, well, it's nearly 3 years now. So hopefully some of you are aware of it. I'll run through what it contains in a bit. Following on from that, in January 2022, we launched our compliance review of the fashion sector. And then in July of that year, we launched our formal investigation into the 3 brands there. And we concluded that investigation earlier this year, in March, and we received undertakings from those 3 businesses. And it's those undertakings that contain some really, really sort of clear information as to what those businesses need to do to comply with consumer protection law. Now, although that's in the fashion retail space, a lot of the obligations on them really do apply equally across other sectors as well, in terms of clarity of messaging, of how to compare claims that you are making. So I would really encourage you to look at those undertakings. We will be shortly issuing a sort of fashion edit of the Green Claims Code, which is to help the fashion retail sector interpret the Green Claims Code, but from their perspective. So that will come out and could be very useful to you as well. At the same time, we also launched a compliance review into fast-moving consumer goods back in January 2023, and at the end of that year, we launched our investigation into Unilever, and that investigation is still ongoing. In between all of that, in March 2022, we were asked by government, by the Department for, I can't remember what it was at the time. Is it Bays? Anyway, it was Kwasi Kwarteng who asked us for the advice, so you can tell how long ago that was. We then gave advice into government around how competition and consumer law could be flexed to help businesses better achieve net zero goals set by the government. We're yet to actually have a response to that advice, but we're hoping that the new government will look at that and come back to us. Basically, what we wanted was for certain legislative change to be made, which would make it much, much clearer what business obligations would be. So the Green Claims Code, basically there are 6 principles, and they're all pretty obvious when you read them. Claims must be truthful and accurate, that's a given, but that's how you comply with the law. But also they must be clear and unambiguous, and just because something is truthful, technically it's accurate, the way it's presented through any marketing or on a page or an advert could be unclear. And I think you have to be very careful how you present some of the information in claims, especially where the words you're using tend to be like vague and very broad in terms of how they can be interpreted by a consumer. The other thing, claims must not omit or hide important information. And this is one that I think a lot of people really grapple with and find quite difficult to sort of understand. But basically, it's if, say, a business has invested more in its fleet of delivery vehicles, and they say we are now, 100% electric, but actually the business itself is investing in the fossil fuel industry or whatever, omitting what the overall impact of the business is, we would say was misleading to consumers, and they are making too much of the small amount of environmental benefits that they are claiming or that they are actually delivering. The other 3 comparisons must be fair and meaningful. This is if you're claiming that something is better for the environment or be using less packaging, make it clear what you're referring to. Is it something that you've used before? Is it a previous product that you've produced? Or is it about other products in the market? Just be very clear what it is. The whole point of this is really to make sure that if the consumer reads something, they understand the context for that claim, they understand what you're saying, and they can make up their mind based on the facts that you give them. The last 2 ones are perhaps a bit more complicated to explain. Claims must be substantiated. This means you've got to have the evidence behind the claim before you make it. It doesn't mean you have to put all that information in a claim or with a claim, but you do need to have that to hand. So if someone like me comes knocking and said, well, look, where's your substantiation for this? But I think increasingly consumers are going to want to know what information you've got to hand. Well, can you prove this claim that you are making? You need to have that with you. And the last thing is that you must consider the full life cycle of the product or service. This links back a bit to the omitting or hiding important information. So it doesn't mean, again, that you need to put all of that life cycle assessment with the claim, but what it does mean is you need to have looked at the overall impact of the product when you're making a claim about perhaps one specific bit of it, and making the claim relevant to that one specific bit, and not making a vague claim that could imply that the benefit applies to the entire product. So I'll just quickly go on to what we've done in the fashion sector. There's the rationale for why we chose it, basically because it's a huge market, really important to the UK economy, but also is one of the biggest producers of global carbon emissions. And we also discovered that there's loads of innovation in the sector, loads of new certification schemes, loads of stuff going on, but also criticism from within the industry. There are some who are clearly trying to really make some huge environmental strides, improving the sustainability of their goods, and they're criticising others within the industry who they think are really only paying lip service to it and are sort of riding on the back of others who are doing a lot more. Also, no one else was looking at the sector, and we were seeing a whole range of issues there. So we decided that this was something that we would prioritise, and it was the first sector we looked at following the publication of the Green Claims Code. So this is sort of like the meat of what we've done, and it's perhaps not the most exciting bit of the presentation, but it's probably the most relevant. And this is where I've just sort of broken down what the undertakings were that we got from the businesses earlier this year. Now, the first two are just basically saying to the business, you need to comply with the law. They've got to remove all their existing environmental claims, remove any that could be potentially misleading, and ensure that all future claims are accurate going forward. And then the next general provisions were more about how they should comply with the provisions of the Green Claims Code. So information must be clear and prominent. And with regarding fabrics, where there are specific technical requirements, then again, they needed to be stated very clearly there, claiming that something already met an industry standard when that's completely standard to everything is over-emphasising the benefits, and clearly that's misleading to the consumer. Also about range criteria. When people are using sort of signposting to a particular range of products, then obviously all products within that range need to meet the criteria. This all sounds fairly obvious, but actually when you look at a load of things and you're actually searching as a consumer, you'll find a lot of these things don't work correctly, and you end up with a product which actually doesn't meet the criteria for that range. Use of imagery, and this is quite an important one. So while you may have written something that's clear and truthful in your claim, if it's then presented with a sort of green background, with trees, with a leaf or something, that could imply far more about what you're actually claiming. And it could imply that the entire product is environmentally friendly, has no impact on the environment, when actually what you're saying only relates to an individual part of the product. Product filters, very similar to the range criteria. And the other thing is about environmental targets. This is where, like, the business has probably put out a whole load of targets about its own brand, its own ethos, and its aims to become a more sustainable business. And if any claim is linked to those targets, then it needs to be clear to the consumer what those targets are, and also how the business is going to meet those targets. And they need to really have a plan, needs to be clear how those targets are going to be met, what action's already been taken. Often you'll see things, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, but there's no real evidence behind those targets. And that needs to be presented to the consumer, not necessarily with the claim, but a clear link to where that information could be found. And then again, product life cycles, overall impact and comparisons really just sort of reflect the provisions of the Green Claims Code. These are the bits, though, that I think you'd be particularly interested in, and I'd really recommend you look at these. We really spent a long time. The reason it took so long between us launching the investigation and publishing the undertakings was simply the sheer complexity of the industry. While we're maybe experts in consumer protection law, certainly not experts in the fashion retail industry. And when we fully understood the sheer complexity of getting something from being produced in one country, produced into thread, dyed, woven, washed, and then transported around the globe, was so complicated, we understood that anything we put in place needed to be practical from a business perspective. So we spent a long time with the businesses working out, really understanding how the industry worked, and then working out, well, okay, then the requirements we put in place to ensure that they wouldn't breach consumer protection law in future were practical from their point of view and weren't putting too much of a burden upon them. And I think this is the one where it'd be really, as I say, look at these undertakings and look at the edit that we're going to put out in a few weeks' time, because I think that should give you a lot more clarity on what would be required here. We also asked the businesses to carry out spot checks to make sure that anything wasn't slipping through the net, and also to put in place new policies and training to ensure that all their staff understood how to avoid making misleading green claims. And this is particularly in the marketing sectors. Very often, because we're a law enforcement agency, when we speak to a business, we immediately speak to the lawyers. Actually, the people we really want to speak to are those responsible for the technical side of the business, because then we really understand how the business operates. And again, when we come to sort of agreeing how the business will operate in future, we can make a practical suggestion as to how they do that. But the other people we really want to speak to are the marketers. And very often we'll get the lawyers saying, can you speak to our marketing department? Because we're trying to explain to them what's needed, and it would be helpful if you did. So again, that's sometimes we have difficulty sort of speaking to the right people in a business. The last two, compliance records and reports on a regular basis, they were specific to us for those businesses. Obviously, another business would not need to do that. So as I say, we published the signed undertakings back in March, and we sent an open letter to the fashion retail sector, basically encouraging them all to look at the undertakings that we had secured and to encourage them to check their own practices to make sure they are compliant. We have also been conducting a wider compliance bit, following on from those undertakings and checking to see if other businesses are living up to those standards that we've set through those undertakings. And then we're not calling it new advice, we're calling it an explanatory supplement to the Green Claims Code, because basically what it is just trying to take the Green Claims Code and word it in a way that is useful for the fashion retail sector. So giving examples specific to that sector, and so makes it more accessible for the sector as a whole. And obviously we're monitoring how those businesses are doing against their undertakings. So moving on to our international work. And whilst that's what we've been doing, I've just been talking about what we've been doing in the UK, the UK and the CMA, we are very active in the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network. It's a whole network around the globe of similar consumer protection agencies to the Competition and Markets Authority. And the last 4 years, we have been co-leading one on misleading environmental claims. And what we are seeing is every year more and more agencies are listing misleading environmental claims as a priority, as a concern. So this is a global issue. And what we are trying to do through this working group is ensure that, as a whole, we understand the issues, so we share what information we have. And also, if we're putting out any guidance, any advice to businesses, we're doing so in the same way. So wherever possible, what you're hearing from the UK will be the same as in the US, as in Australia, and elsewhere around the globe. So that business can get as consistent and coherent a picture of what they need to do to comply with the law. The laws will differ around the world, but most of us have laws requiring businesses to tell the truth, not to mislead, unconscionable conduct, and all these things that we describe in different ways, but ultimately the core components of our law are more or less the same. And also domestically, not just internationally, we're working very closely with others. We're also working very closely, especially with the Advertising Standards Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority. The ASO we meet with very, very regularly, just to make sure, because their codes that they enforce, although they don't have the same standing as the law, they are more or less based upon the law that we use, which is the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations. So we meet with them very regularly, again, to make sure that any messaging we're putting out is completely consistent. So that if you're complying with the ASA's guidance, then you can guarantee you're not going to be in conflict with something in our guidance, but it's worth reading both, because obviously we cover slightly different remits. And also the Financial Conduct Authority, they issued guidance last year on a greenwashing rule that they've introduced. We work very closely with them, and if you compare the wording of all three of our sets of guidance, you'll see they're very, very closely aligned. So what we're trying to do, both internationally and domestically, is ensure that the messages you're getting on how to comply with the law are as consistent as possible, and we're being as helpful as we can be. The other thing we're doing, obviously we're no longer in the European Union, but there are 2 new directives coming, and they won't apply in the UK, obviously, but what we are conscious of is that businesses are going to need to comply with these directives going forward, and what we want to make sure is that anything we are introducing in the UK or saying by way of guidance doesn't conflict with any guidance that's likely to be coming out from Europe. It's likely that you're going to have to do things differently in Europe, but what we're trying to do is ensure that if you comply with European legislation, it shouldn't cause a conflict with complying with UK legislation. And one last thing, I always forget this, which I really shouldn't, because earlier this year, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act received royal assent. Again, a bit of a mouthful. You're thinking, well, what's that got to do with us? The reason is it doesn't change the law. The Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations will be transposed into this, but what's required there in terms of misleading actions, misleading omissions, aggressive actions, that's all the same. The law is the same. But what has changed, or will change, we expect the powers to come in probably next year, probably April, we will have powers to make a decision that a business has breached the law. We can do that on the competition side. We make a judgment and we can impose a fine. At the moment, on the consumer protection side, if we investigate someone and we need to change the way that they're behaving, we have to go to court. And it's for a court to then impose an order on them requiring that business to then comply with the law. What the undertakings are that we secured earlier this year are in lieu of going to court. So we always set out that we will go to court, but if a business is prepared to give us undertakings, we'll accept them. From next April, probably, we will have the ability to actually say, no, you've breached the law, here's the evidence, we say you've breached it, and we can then impose a fine up to 10% of global turnover, which is quite drastic. It's exactly the same as we've got on the competition side. We can do it, or we will be able to do it, on the consumer protection side. So it's just an important thing to be aware of. It's not a threat, but if you are going to get your house in order, I'd suggest you do it fairly soon rather than wait until we've got these powers, lest we come knocking and find that you're in breach of the law. And that is everything from me. Plenty of time for questions, if any of you've got them. I appreciate there's a lot there, not perhaps the most exciting thing you're going to hear today, but it is probably one of the most necessary things you need to be aware of as you go forward. But happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mike. Just one question. Obviously, I can understand why there was a focus specifically on fashion. Can you see a focus on any other segments of retail where, say, furniture or toys or even a materials focus would help guide retailers or wholesalers in a direction of exactly what they need to do?
Yeah, I think the fashion retail edit, or whatever we're calling it, is going to be relevant. This is what I say, even though we can only really issue the guidance in that sector because we've looked at it and we actually understand it, well, as far as we can, because it's so complicated. But to give guidance in those other sectors, we'd really need to engage with that sector, I think, and really understand it, because when it comes to it, we want the guidance to be practical. We really want it to be accessible for businesses, whereas at the moment it's quite high level. And so to give them the detailed sort of guidance that we would like to, we'd really need to investigate it fully. So we probably won't be issuing other guidance, but I think there's a lot in the fashion retail one. Certainly when it comes to fabric composition and all of that other stuff, which you could relate to components of products more broadly, I think you should find it quite useful, hopefully.